Hello, Mr. Almond here, and this is your Almondcast on carbon. Carbon is arguably the most important element to living things. With the exception of water, all of the other important molecules found within cells are built upon carbon. Proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids. Carbon is an essential ingredient in all of them. Without carbon, we wouldn't be able to build all the molecules that carry out metabolism and do all of the work within our cells. So we will use carbon today as an example to show how it is that nutrients, like carbon, but as well other molecules like phosphorus, sodium, magnesium, nitrogen, how it is that they interact between the living and non-living components within an ecosystem. Now you should remember from earlier in the year that an ecosystem is defined as all of the abiotic and biotic factors present in an area. In other words, it's all of the living and non-living things with an emphasis on how it is that those non-living things support the life of the community of organisms within a place. Now, matter and energy and understanding the roles of each are vital to understanding how it is that an ecosystem is structured and how it is that it works. And an interesting intersection here between those is found as we look at climate. Now, climate can be loosely defined as the long-term patterns of weather within an area. Climate is by nature geographic. Where it is that you are physically located makes a big difference in determining what the climate is going to be. Now, climate differs due to seasonality, which has a lot to do with the tilt of the Earth and the rotation of the Earth around the sun. But it's also influenced a lot by the circulation of air and water as ocean currents and wind patterns like the jet stream bring nutrients and temperature to a particular place. The topography, things like mountain ranges, also play a big factor in determining exactly what the climate is going to be. Now, the climate is going to have a few factors that are going to be really important in determining exactly what it's going to be like, but that's going to vary depending on where you are. We can break down all of the different climate zones into biomes, and biomes are going to be the type of living organisms that are present in an area of Earth based upon the local climate. Now, the terrestrial or land-based biomes, the main factors that are going to affect these areas are precipitation and temperature. The amount of precipitation present in an area obviously influences the amount of photosynthesis that can occur. And the more producers you have within an ecosystem, then the more consumers and overall the greater the diversity of life will be. Now, temperature, because temperature impacts metabolism and also impacts photosynthetic rates, the higher the temperature, the more life that will be supported in that area. The terrestrial biomes are going to be distributed roughly based on latitude, the distance that you are from the equator, because the closer to the equator, the more solar energy that's going to be received, and therefore there's going to be both higher temperatures as well as a greater potential rate of photosynthesis. In aquatic ecosystems, water is in no short supply. Additionally, the thermal properties of water allow for greater stability in terms of temperatures in comparison to the land biomes. However, light is more of an issue in aquatic environments, because the further you go beneath the surface of the water, the less light from the sun is able to reach down into the depths. So therefore you're going to see a concentration of life in that zone near the surface where light is able to penetrate. While the types of biomes, both on land and the water, for the most part is not significant to the course, one important example that we will look at the end of this video is the coral reef. Coral reefs are going to be near the surface, mostly tropical areas. They are very rich in life. The corals are small animals, which we'll look at the end of the video, and they provide a suitable home for a great abundance of fish and other forms of life. And so we see that the greatest amount of life, both in number and in diversity, is present within coral reefs, these shallow zones within the oceans. Now, the physical laws do apply to living systems as well. And so those things that we know to be true about matter and energy in general apply specifically to the interactions of matter and energy within ecosystems. The conservation of energy is something that you've learned about already, and how energy needs to be constantly supplied to an ecosystem from the sun because energy is being lost continuously. A greater focus in this video is going to be looking at the conservation of matter. Because the amount of matter present on the Earth is fixed. There isn't new matter, not a significant amount of it, coming onto the Earth from beyond. Therefore, the number and type of atoms that we have present on the Earth now is the same as it's going to be in the future. So therefore, it's important for us to look at how life deals with this potential short supply. And that is through nutrient cycles. You can see that red represents the flow of energy coming into, but then ultimately being lost from the organisms as it doesn't transfer or it's being lost due to metabolic heat. Whereas the chemical cycling, the blue arrows showing that as one organism consumes another, the matter is passed on, but ultimately as organisms die, sometimes through microorganisms, but in some form or another, those things are going to cycle back to those primary producers to be used again. So the carbon that was used by a plant millions of years ago will eventually be reused by some plant again in the future. The roles of organisms are important with that. So in our microbiology unit, the role of decomposers, particularly the saprotrophs, is something that we're going to emphasize. Now, nutrients, therefore, can be a limiting factor. Limiting factors are resources that will limit the distribution and abundance of organisms. In other words, if something is in short supply, because it's in short supply, not all organisms will be able to obtain it, and if it's necessary for life, lacking it means that life is limited. Now, we'll focus here on plants and the place that plants grow, which is primarily now in soil. Plants are the predominant organism, both again in number and mass, in terms of what it is that actually lives and grows on land. So therefore, understanding what it is that limits plants will then help us to understand life in general. Soil quality, in terms of the depth and particularly the nutrient composition, as well as the amount of water, which is greatly influenced by climate, those are going to be the things that are going to primarily influence the primary production within terrestrial ecosystems. Primary production is going to be the total amount of mass of plants, of any species growing within that place. So as precipitation increases, as you can see in this graph, the amount of plant life will be able to increase with it fairly steadily. We've already covered energy transfer and how energy is lost as it moves from one trophic level to another. So instead, we're going to be looking right now at the carbon cycle and nutrient cycles more broadly. So nutrient cycles are defined as the methods by which biotic and abiotic reservoirs interact to move one particular nutrient from one source to another. It is going to move between organic and inorganic forms. This generalized nutrient cycle will give you an idea of some of the major processes that are going along within this process. So reservoir A is going to be all of the living things within any of the trophic levels. Those living things, if buried, they can be fossilized into things like peat, coal, and oil. These fossil fuels are things that are buried, and they're going to be unavailable to nutrients unavailable as nutrients to living things in the future under most circumstances. You have reservoir C over here are inorganic materials that are available as nutrients. So things present in the atmosphere, in the water, or in the soil. So in this case, living things growing in the soil might take up, for example, plants taking up phosphorus through their roots. You can have things that are dissolved in the water, so aquatic organisms are able to absorb it from the water, or gases that are present in the atmosphere which can be taken in through biological processes like photosynthesis or respiration. Now, in some cases, those things can get locked away as minerals in rocks, so literally become part of the rock layers, which then get buried. And again, this is a reservoir which makes it unavailable as nutrients under most circumstances. So these reservoirs B and D, these inorganic forms, are places, again, where there's generally long-term storage of these nutrients away from living things. There's going to be much more movement between reservoirs A and C, as we'll see for a moment in the carbon cycle. Water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. These are going to be the primary cycles that are going to impact the growth of plants. And because plants provide the basis for all of our ecosystems, for all of our communities, I should say, understanding each of these is important in knowing how much of a particular plant is really able to grow. However, carbon is the one that you need to know in great detail. So if we look at this more detailed image, what you should be aware of for the carbon cycle are some of the processes that cause the movement of carbon from one form into another, and then what are some of the forms that carbon takes in these different parts, again, both organic and inorganic forms. Within the atmosphere, which is where a lot of carbon is going to be available, the two main inorganic forms that we find there are carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4. Now, carbon dioxide is going to predominate, but there is a significant amount of methane available in the atmosphere as well. In the ocean, carbon can actually diffuse from CO2 in the air to CO2 in the water. So there is a movement by diffusion from the air into the water. As the amount of carbon dioxide in the air increases or decreases, there would then be an appropriate response due to diffusion increasing or decreasing the amount of CO2 dissolved in the water. Some of that CO2, once dissolved in the water, will get turned into carbonic acid. So more carbon dioxide in the air leads to a greater amount of acid in the water. Now, the photosynthetic organisms, particularly plankton, will take in that CO2 as part of photosynthesis. Additionally, you have other organisms which will be able to convert some of the carbon present in the plankton or carbon that is dissolved in the water and actually take that up and form minerals. In particular, shell-forming organisms, think things like clams and oysters, will actually use that carbon to build their shells. And that effectively is going to fossilize some of that carbon into a kind of permanent sediments. So you can see the reactive sediments here at the bottom is going to be made up a lot of those shells, the shells of corals and clams, all combined together there at the bottom of the ocean. Respiration is occurring as well in aquatic ecosystems because you have all of the zooplankton and all of the fish and the other animals that will consume and then use respiration as a way to be able to unlock some of the energy present in those carbon-containing molecules in the carbohydrates of the plankton. And as they respire, that's going to release carbon dioxide into the water, which will then diffuse back into the air. So you have photosynthesis and respiration happening with this life in the ocean in the same way that you have photosynthesis and respiration happening on land. Now, interestingly, you can see this particular diagram gives you measurements in gigatons of carbon in terms of the amount of carbon that's moving from one form into the other. And so even though as land-dwelling animals we are biased towards what's happening on land, you can see that the numbers here are quite significant in terms of the amount of carbon that's actually moving into those tiny organisms within particularly the oceans. Now, in the land, particularly within the soil, we have decomposition happening. So as the plants and animals and other living things die, those things can get buried. They can be fossilized into coal, peat, natural gas, and other fossil fuels. But also there's natural decomposition happening. Some of that carbon can get converted into carbon dioxide, which gets released back into the atmosphere. But you have a variety of carbon-containing compounds which end up becoming a part of the soil. Not present here on this diagram is the source of methane. While respiration is going to produce carbon dioxide as a product that will be released into the atmosphere, methane is also going to be a product of respiration, however not aerobic respiration, but the process of anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is something that happens when an organism consumes molecules and produces energy when oxygen is not present. So significant places where this is occurring are by bacteria, which are in the soil, particularly swampy areas like a peat bog, as well as within the intestinal tracts of animals, particularly ruminants like cows. So as those bacteria are in an atmosphere deprived of oxygen, consuming things like carbohydrates, instead of carbon being combined with oxygen and making CO2, that carbon is instead combined with hydrogen to make CH4, which gets released into the air. And methane, though more rare than carbon dioxide, is a more potent greenhouse gas. Which brings us finally in this diagram to the red numbers. Those red numbers indicate things that are happening based upon the actions of humans, above and beyond that which is happening by natural systems. And so although the numbers of gigatons of carbon moved here into the atmosphere by human sources is less than what you see from the natural sources, it is the fact that this is an increase above and beyond the natural amount of carbon that makes the effect of this additional CO2 much more notable. The burning of fossil fuels in particular is significant because these fossil fuels would have been buried for many millions of years into the future. But as humans burn those things and release that CO2 by combustion into the air, that means that there's going to be a much greater amount of carbon dioxide, which leads to a final part of this video, which is the topic of climate change.